This is Superman, who grew up without loving parents. This is also Superman, but he lived for thousands of years before arriving on our planet to conquer it. And this is also Superman, but he just doesn't care anymore. In recent years, comic book movies and TV shows have consistently been stagnating, with numerous box office bombs from studios that used to make up to billions of dollars on every other comic book movie. However, movies and TV shows about anti-heroes or just straight-up villains are getting a tremendous amount of attention, with the meteoric rise of The Boys, The Joker, Invincible, or more recently Gen V. But are these two things connected by causation or correlation? Or are they merely the opposite end symptoms of the same phenomenon? That is what I'll attempt to find out today, so buckle up and let's dig into why people like watching superheroes getting blown up. Shows like The Boys and Invincible were not the first attempts at deconstructing the superhero genre. In fact, it has been done many times in the past. But what is new is the very steep parallel of the decline of traditional comic book content, both in terms of success and quality. People have always wondered, from the inception of the idea of a superhero, what if they went rogue and potentially evil? What if Superman decided that he hates humans, or if he wasn't brought up by loving parents? What if he became jaded and didn't care about humans anymore? What if Batman did cross the line and started killing people? And in general, what if the power of a superhero ended up in the wrong hands? Some of the most influential works from the past that probably had a significant effect on the development of comics like The Boys include The Watchmen, which was first published in 1986, almost 40 years ago. And if you haven't read it or watched the movie, I highly recommend both in this order. You would be amazed at how ahead of its time and mature it was, and how similar some of its ideas were to the modern anti-superhero content of today. It featured a team of superheroes consisting of very fallible and sometimes just vile humans. Some characters carried out vigilante justice with a strict moral code, but without the limitations of things like Batman's no-kill rule. It also introduced a superior, almost omnipotent figure who was like a god to regular humans, but without Superman's inexhaustible hope and goodwill. Put in the middle of a story with a very cynical but grounded and realistic look at the actual world, using the heroes as juxtaposition, signifying the messages and themes about abuse of power, greed, desire, and trauma. All deeply human things. Watchmen was a fresh, creative, and dark look at the world of superheroes, but it wasn't a response to a fatigue of comic books and heroes from the people. It was simply a different, edgy, but genius idea from the mind of Alan Moore, who first wanted to use actual, already existing characters for the story, but supposedly got pushback from DC, and was suggested to create characters similar to the heroes, which kind of became a pattern later on, with the very clear caricatures of actual, existing comic book characters. Speaking of geniuses, Frank Miller, creator of iconic stories like Sin City and 300, also dabbled in subverting the superhero genre with darker, grittier takes on characters. His famous 1986 series, The Dark Knight Returns, featured an older, burnt-out Batman, who is more violent and weakened by old age, and the Joker is so twisted he literally breaks his own neck when Batman refuses to kill him. These stories had a real impact on the world of comic books and their respective adaptations, and revealed that there is an adult and perhaps a bit more cynical audience with a serious demand for stories featuring faulty anti-heroes, stories in which the villain succeeds, and a more mature, realistic look at these unrealistic scenarios. As you can see, the theme of dark superhero stories is nothing new, and it has dribbled into more traditional comic book movies as well throughout the years. People love Loki, for example, a genocidal villain, so much they made him into an actual hero. We have had numerous stories where the villain goes through a good old redemption arc and even sacrifices themselves for a cause, providing depth to an otherwise black and white story. DC has consistently been pushing a darker, grittier look on superheroes, and it's not just Zack Snyder. Christopher Nolan did the same, but better. Nowadays, I would argue that people feel DC went overboard, and now there is an opposite demand for more cheerful, brighter stories, and it looks like James Gunn is taking the DCU in that direction. And though I am skeptical, I'm curious to see how it goes. But these mainstream villain redemption arcs and more or less grey characters like Loki are nothing compared to the edge of Homelander blasting civilians with laser. So what tipped the balance? I would argue that the combination of quite a few factors, that some of you might even find controversial, but hear me out. I think the year 2019 is what tipped the scale for the rise of the anti-hero. In terms of movies and TV shows, 2019 is when Avengers Endgame, Joker, and the first season of The Boys aired. While there were franchise movies as well, like Spider-Man Far From Home, Captain Marvel, and Dark Phoenix, even Shazam, Endgame signified an end of an era. The main characters doing the heavy lifting for Marvel got some kind of closure. And no matter how hard Marvel tried to spin it like, hey, now the new guys take the mantle, here's the Falcon and Captain Marvel, and the new generation of superheroes, there is no parallel universe in which the people show the same enthusiasm for these guys as for Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man or Chris Evans' Captain. It just wasn't happening. But the studio kept pretending, hoping, coping that it will eventually. And lo and behold, none of these characters stuck the landing. Very surprising, right? So the Avengers saga ended, and the Boys and the Joker were an immediate alternative to the myriad of samey Marvel movies. And then the pandemic happened, followed by one of the most depressing few years for most people. A year full of conflicts, uncertainty, distrust, and nihilism. What better time for an era of villains and anti-heroes? In the same year as Endgame, The Boys came out of seemingly nowhere, with very few known actors, absolutely carried by the charismatic performances across the board, with Tony Starr and Karl Urban as standouts. An extremely edgy story, shock value, adult themes and humor, and almost on-the-nose caricatures of characters we have been watching and reading for decades. While the story wasn't very deep, could be summed up as what if superheroes but bad, it came at a perfect time, after a bombardment of the family-friendly, more and more mass-produced Marvel movies, and the constant controversial stumbling of Snyder's DC movies. It really felt like an answer to those, starting to get burnt out on the genre. You keep making the same stuff? I'll keep watching your heroes get sliced up into pieces in this alternate universe, because it is just more fun. Homelander really is just an evil Superman. Queen Maeve really is an alcoholic Wonder Woman. Deep is a perverted Aquaman, A-Train is a junkie Flash, and the Compound V-infused youth is a sick and twisted X-Men. These obvious tropes and twists on characters that are embedded in our brains and many of our childhoods evokes a fresh, guilty pleasure-like experience that came at just the right time. Joker, on the other hand, was a much more mature but nonetheless similarly deconstructive look at a traditional iconic villain. However, in this movie, Joker is not really a villain. Even anti-hero is stretching it. He is clearly a victim, provoking empathy from the viewer. A victim of trauma, abuse, mental health issues, and of course, he lives in a society.
We live in a society.
In any other movie, this wouldn't even be considered as a villainous role. But the connotation of Joker as we know him keeps us in the perfect illusion of watching the classic Batman story's menace's origins. The reality is, the movie draws much, and I mean much more inspiration from movies like The King of Comedy and Taxi Driver, and I would argue that as much so from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Fight Club. While it was heavily criticized for especially the first two comparisons, I think it's a pretty great mixture of combining ideas from iconic stories that stood the test of time and popular culture that rarely gets brought up with the likes of such cinematic masterpieces. The result is not the most original work I've seen, but excellently done, well directed and masterfully acted. And the reason for Joker's success lies in the combination of these well-deserved credits and the merits of the source materials. Now, as while the release of Joker and The Boys wasn't really an attempt to bring down superhero movies, it's kind of what happened in the following years, because in an ideal world, what would be the perfect response to them? A true return to form, well done, uplifting comic book movies to show the world the other side of the spectrum has value still, and on par with the cynical subversion of heroes. But the 2020 repertoire of mention-worthy comic book movies were Wonder Woman 1984, Birds of Prey, New Mutants, and Bloodshot, I guess? And notable TV shows like The CW's Stargirl. These were all disasters, just all around awful. The Boys, on the other hand, kept going strong with season 2. Next year, DC brought Suicide Squad, which was very in line with the glorified villains and anti-heroes on their eyes, while Marvel tried to bring it back with Shang-Chi and Spider-Man No Way Home. But the year was riddled with stinkers like Eternals, Black Widow, Venom 2, and streaming TV shows like WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. You may disagree with me on this one, but I think Invincible blew all these far away, featuring yet another deconstructed version of a classic superhero squad, another evil Superman in the form of Omni-Man, and just a very well-made action-packed adventure series. And the trend continues, the never-ending slop of mass-produced products like Morbius, Black Adam, Thor Love and Thunder, The Flash, The Marvels, Aquaman 2, Ant-Man whatever, Secret Invasion, She-Hulk. Going into why all these suck would not only take hours, it would mean watching them for a second time, which I wouldn't do for anything. The outliers are the ones distant from this interconnected world of mediocrity, like Across the Spider-Verse and The Batman, while The Boys, Invincible, Gen V and the like just keep coming. And that is what the people prefer now, as it is clearly shown by the bomb after bomb of the 2 years of awful superhero movies I just listed, and the parallel glorification of characters like Homelander and Omni-Man, as these characters, aside from the memes, are now associated with being the leading figures of the anti-superhero packaged trash we keep getting. I could go on for a while about why these characters are actually celebrated while intended to be villains, but that is the topic for a whole other video. If you want to see that, please tell me in the comments, or by subscribing to Space Crow Productions, becoming part of the 1% elite subscribed viewers of mine. Back to superheroes, I think we need a clean slate here. And funnily enough, as DC has been behind Marvel in terms of planning and rollout for a decade plus now, they are miles ahead of Marvel, who still seem to be huffing and puffing that copium, waiting for Ironheart or whatever to change the tide. DC is actually wiping the slate clean with James Gunn. And while I loved Henry Cavill as Superman, I can get behind something new as long as it's good, and I genuinely feel the need for a well-made, uplifting, classic or modern comic book story, done well to actually bring balance in the force. Because I think all these glorified villains and anti-heroes could coexist in a nice satirical balance with competent comic book movies. The villain stories is where I feel the necessity for more originality now. The Boys and Invincible, while they have many original plot points, are clearly based on existing material. The Joker was heavily influenced by works of the past, so in my mind, it is time for a new Watchmen, no matter how unrealistic that sounds. Something that is based on familiarity but undeniably creative and new, with original and dark twists with more mature themes. Speaking of villains, I recently did a video on the state of Star Wars, with the upcoming Acolyte led by the lovely Leslie Headland, so check it out if you are interested in Star Wars. And speaking of anti-heroes, villains and subverted heroes, if you like this sort of stuff you will love Dune. Maybe you already do, and I happen to have made an in-depth deep dive into Dune Part 2 that also tackles this subject, so check it out. Don't forget to subscribe for much more content like this about the upcoming Boys season and all things movies and TV shows, and see you soon.